as they unfold in the shooting down of a Korean jumbo jet off the coast of a Soviet military outpost. Among those killed when the plane came down was a Georgia Congressman, Larry McDonald. We'll find out what his wife has to say. She believes there was a conspiracy to kill her husband, and she is thinking now about trying to succeed him in Congress. We'll see what Kathy McDonald has to say about the death of her husband and find out what she wants this country to do about it. From Flushing Meadows, New York, we will see the results produced on day 3 at the U.S. Open tennis tournament. And also tonight we will have a report on the passing of Washington State Senator Henry Scoop Jackson. Newsnight is next. Hello, this is Newsnight on the Cable News Network. The ruling party in Israel picks a new leader. President Reagan sends more Marines to the waters off Lebanon, and a killer dies in the gas chamber.
We will update the Korean airliner story, but first,
as to how the flight got off course, why the Soviets blasted it out of the sky, and how the United States plans now to respond. President Reagan may answer some of those questions in just about 10 hours. He'll be addressing the nation just before noon Eastern Time. The Soviets may never reveal why they made the attack. Their answers so far have only angered the White House and the rest of the nation, which has labeled the incident as inexplicable, barbaric. The United Nations will look for some answers on Friday when the Security Council takes up the question. One thing is certain tonight. 269 people died when a civilian jet was attacked. Jim Clancy reports on that attack and on the search for bodies in the Sea of Japan.
Heavy fog hampered search efforts in the area of Sakhalin Island. There is almost no hope that any of the 269 people aboard Korean Airlines Flight 007 will be found alive. At least 30 Americans, including Congressman Larry McDonald of Georgia, were aboard the plane, which the State Department says was shot down by a missile fired from a Soviet Su-15 fighter. Because of the sophisticated navigational equipment aboard the Boeing 747, Korean airline officials say they do not believe it strayed off course. But at the State Department Thursday morning, Secretary George Shultz said, in fact, the unarmed aircraft had strayed over the Soviet island of Sakhalin.
The aircraft strayed into Soviet airspace over the Kamchatka Peninsula and over the Sea of Okhotsk and over the Sakhalin Islands. The Soviets tracked the commercial airliner for some 2.5 hours. A Soviet pilot reported visual contact with the aircraft at 1812 hours. The Soviet plane was, we know, in constant contact with its ground control. At 1821 hours, the Korean aircraft was reported by the Soviet pilot at 10,000 meters. At 1826 hours, the Soviet pilot reported that he fired a missile and the target was destroyed.
The flight path between Anchorage, Alaska and Seoul, Korea regularly takes commercial aircraft within 80 miles of Soviet airspace. Airspace considered sensitive because of military installations on the Kamchatka Peninsula. Secretary of State Shultz made it clear that intelligence sources were monitoring the conversations between the Soviet fighters and their ground controllers. But it remains unclear what happened during the period when Soviet fighters had visual contact with the jumbo jet. The official word from TASS received at the State Department said only that the Soviet fighter planes tried to assist the 747 to the nearest base. The message was the same from Radio Moscow.
The intruder plane did not react to the signals and warnings of the Soviet fighter plane and continued its flight towards the Sea of Japan.
Neither TASS nor Radio Moscow made any mention of shooting down the unarmed jet, but they did say its navigational lights appeared to be inoperative, perhaps signaling the jet was having electrical problems. Korean airline executives said any pilot with so many civilian passengers aboard would have certainly obeyed directions from fighter aircraft. Korea and the United States are still awaiting a satisfactory response from the Soviet Union as to why the passenger plane was destroyed in midair. Jim Clancy, CNN.
Reaction to the downing of the Korean jetliner was quick and it was stinging. In Washington, former President Jimmy Carter blasted the Soviet Union for the incident.
They attack by the Soviet Union against a defenseless and well-identified private commercial carrier loaded with civilian passengers is totally unwarranted. There is no possible legitimate excuse that the Soviet government could put forward for this despicable action. And I don't want to get in a role publicly of advising the President what action to take. But we should express in the clearest possible terms the abhorrence that we share with the rest of the world about this killing of innocent people.
On Capitol Hill, Georgia Congressman Newt Gingrich called the incident a premeditated attack by the Soviet Union.
Candidly, I think what happened is that somebody yesterday made a decision to shoot down an airplane, that they discovered after the plane was shot down that Congressman McDonald was on the plane, and that what was an act of beating up on a small country, South Korea, suddenly became a major international incident involving the death of an American congressman, and that they are now going to try to lie their way out of it. I think that they're sort of like a mugger who suddenly found they had jumped on a bigger victim than they thought.
Gingrich called for immediate action by the United States in response to the Soviet attack.
Stone. Here are this morning's top stories. Senator Henry Jackson, the Washington Democrat who spent more than 40 years in Congress, has died of a massive heart attack. President Reagan has called an emergency meeting of his national security advisors to decide just how to respond to the apparent Soviet attack on a Korean Airlines jumbo jet. And members of Congress have reacted with outrage to words of the incident and the death of Georgia Representative Larry McDonald on the airplane. Details of these stories and the rest of the news just ahead. Also this morning on Night Watch, why would a Soviet fighter attack an unarmed civilian airliner? We'll look into this mystery with Congressman Denny Smith, a former airline and combat fighter pilot. What's ahead for Israel? A report on the man chosen to succeed Menachem Begin.
Good morning, I'm Chris Glenn. The man the Senate called Scoop is dead. Washington Democrat Henry Jackson died of a heart attack on Thursday night. President Reagan is cutting short his vacation and returning to Washington today for a special meeting of his National Security Council at issue how to respond to the reported Soviet attack on a South Korean jumbo jet. Deborah Potter has our report.
I want to speculate beyond that now.
Administration officials who informed President Reagan that the plane had been shot down described him as angry and deeply disturbed. White House spokesman Larry Speaks said the incident seemed incredible and demanded a full accounting.
There are no circumstances that can justify the unprecedented attack on an unarmed civilian aircraft. The Soviet Union owes an explanation to the world about how and why this tragedy has occurred.
At the time, officials said there were no plans for the president to cut short his vacation, and he went for his regular horseback ride on his mountaintop ranch. Aides said that anything he could do at the White House, he could do there.
The president is keeping in touch with it and has been providing direction all morning from this location.
When the Soviets finally put out their version of the incident, the United States called it unacceptable. As reported by TASS, an unidentified plane violated Soviet airspace twice and fighters were scrambled, but there was no mention of any shots. The reaction in Santa Barbara was a toughly worded statement from the president describing the Soviet actions as utter barbarity.
Words can scarcely express our revulsion at this horrifying act of violence. The United States joins with other members of the international community in demanding a full explanation for this appalling and wanton misdeed. The Soviet statements to this moment have totally failed to explain how or why this tragedy has occurred.
Officials here began to worry that given the circumstances, it wouldn't have looked right for the president to stay on his ranch. So he's returning to Washington later today for an urgent meeting with his national security advisors. On the agenda, options for action to protest the incident. Sources say there's almost no chance of strong sanctions. Canceling the grain agreement the U.S. just signed is seen as extremely unlikely. But relations are badly strained, and there is concern that the incident could have repercussions in the critical area of arms control. Deborah Potter, CBS News, Santa Barbara. CBS News, Santa Barbara.
A number of diplomatic moves are likely to come up for consideration when Mr. Reagan returns to Washington. One option would be calling off next week's meeting between Secretary Shultz and Soviet Foreign Minister Andrei Gromyko. That possibility is not considered likely at this point. Another option would be to deny U.S. landing rights to the Soviet airline Aeroflot. And the recent U.S. decision to lift controls on sales of pipeline technology may now be reconsidered. But for many people in Washington, it was too soon to talk about reprisal. It was a time for shock and anger, a time for reaction to an action that some found too grotesque for words.
I cannot imagine an adequate answer. And so I am left with a vision of ruthless brutality and contempt for the opinion of mankind.
I think the shooting down of an unarmed civilian plane is an outrageous, despicable, cowardly, murderous act.
We should speak and act in no uncertain terms to show our indignation over this act.
The Pentagon has already responded to events in the Far East. David Martin has more on this and a look at the other side of the coin, Soviet intrusions into American airspace.
The Air Force has sent an AWACS radar plane and 5 F-15 fighter escorts from their base on Okinawa to northern Japan. The planes are there to help in any search for the remnants of Flight 7 and its 269 passengers. But Pentagon officials hold out slim hope of retrieving anything, since most of the wreckage is inside Soviet territorial waters. Additional military moves, such as sending an aircraft carrier, do not seem likely, since there is little a show of force could accomplish now. Instead, the Reagan administration seems bent on making as strong a case as possible condemning the Soviet attack. Not since the Cuban Missile Crisis has any administration deliberately disclosed so much highly classified intelligence. In this case, the contents of intercepted Soviet radio communications.
At 18:26 hours, the Soviet pilot reported that he fired a missile and the target was destroyed.
For one intelligence expert who used to be in charge of intercepting Soviet communications, the gamble was worthwhile.
Protection of sensitive intelligence methods is a very important thing, so that we not lose them. It's very important to our security. But there come times when the national interest requires a choice between some degree of disclosure and the national interest.
Among other things, Shultz's revelations showed just how closely the two superpowers watch each other. The United States guards its airspace just as jealously as the Soviet Union, but not as viciously. Soviet Bear bombers occasionally test U.S. air defenses by flying unannounced into the American air defense zone. Each time, the U.S. scrambles fighter aircraft to intercept the Soviet bombers, but only to escort them out. When it comes to Soviet airliners that stray from their flight paths, the U.S. usually does no more than file a mild protest with Moscow. U.S. officials say those stray Aeroflot flights are no accident. They cite one incident not too long ago when a Soviet jetliner managed to wander off course and overfly a Connecticut shipyard on the very day a new nuclear submarine was being launched. This is David Martin.
We'll have more on Flight 7 in just a few minutes. Turning now to other top stories, 2,000 more Marines head for Lebanon today. The new troops will remain offshore aboard a heavily armed amphibious assault ship. From
ABC News, this is World News This Morning for Friday, September 2nd, 1983. It's 6 a.m. Now from our Washington News Desk, Steve Bell and Kathleen Sullivan.
Good morning, everyone. In the top of the news this morning, Soviet and Japanese ships are continuing their search for the wreckage of that South Korean jetliner shot down by a Soviet fighter.
Also this morning, Senator Henry Jackson of Washington has died of a heart attack.
Now the latest on the Korean plane tragedy. The Soviet Union still refuses to acknowledge that one of its fighter interceptors shot down a Korean airliner with 269 people on board. The Soviets insist their ships and planes are doing all they can to look for wreckage. At the same time, however, they have kept Japanese rescue ships from entering the believed crash area. We get the latest on the search from Bill Rediker.
More than 300 members of Japan's self-defense forces conducted a search operation in the northern Japan Sea. Officials at this radar station in Hokkaido knew where to look since they had monitored the Russian conversations between the Soviet-attacked aircraft and their control staff. However, 4 Japanese patrol ships were ordered by Soviet authorities to stay away from the suspected crash site because these waters are restricted and have been claimed by the Soviet Union. Nevertheless, an oil slick 42 miles off of one of the Soviet islands was identified by Japanese fishermen. And this trawler captain says he heard a couple of loud explosions and saw a bright flash in the sky at the time of the incident. Earlier today, Soviet Ambassador Vladimir Pavlov, in a meeting with the Japanese Foreign Ministry, confirmed the sighting of aircraft wreckage, but denied that his country intentionally shot down the Korean Airlines 747. Japanese relatives of the victims were brought to Korean Airlines headquarters here today. In all, 27 Japanese passengers were on the flight, along with about 30 Americans, including Congressman Larry McDonald from Georgia. At the Soviet embassy here, security was tripled as Japanese-Soviet relations, always marginal at best, plunged to an all-time low. The Prime Minister's office called the incident an extremely regrettable and unforgivable action. Bill Redeker, ABC News, Tokyo.
The Korean jet was shot down about 4 hours from the end of a long journey that began in New York City. Vera Seraphin now looks at what happened on the plane's final flight.
Korean Airlines Flight 7, a jumbo jet like this one, left New York Tuesday night just before midnight en route to Seoul, South Korea. 10 hours later, after a refueling stop, the plane left Anchorage, Alaska, still bound for Seoul. But then, according to both U.S. and Soviet accounts, the airliner strayed off course, 100 miles north of its planned route, traveling over the Kamchatka Peninsula and Sakhalin Island, entering Soviet airspace twice. 2 hours out of Anchorage at noon Eastern Time on Wednesday, the Russians began tracking the plane, which was now on a course that took it over a Soviet submarine base, a course headed for the Soviet city of Vladivostok. According to U.S. accounts, the pilot of a Soviet jet fighter made visual contact with the jumbo jet at 2:12 Eastern Time. And 14 minutes later, that pilot fired a missile, knocking the Korean plane out of the sky.
We know that at least 8 Soviet fighters reacted at one time or another to the airliner. The pilot who shot the aircraft down reported after the attack that he had in fact fired a missile, that he had destroyed the target, and that he was breaking away.
The Soviets have not acknowledged shooting down the Korean plane. American and Russian accounts of what happened do agree that Soviet pilots tried to warn the jetliner, and they agree that a search has turned up no survivors. Barry Seraphin, ABC News, Washington.
The families of many of the Americans aboard that Korean jet were shocked by the news.
What do we do? All your politicians are going to be banging their heads against the wall, and they're going to be issuing wonderful statements for the next month or so, and the incident will be just completely passed off.
How many lives had to be taken away before the country do something about it?
War? No, I don't believe in more deaths. I lost a brother in the Second World War. I know what the horrors are. We don't need that. That's not going to bring them back.
Korean Airlines says it plans no changes in the route that the planes fly from the United States to South Korea.
This is a CBS News special report. Here is Dan Rather.
President Reagan arriving at this moment at Point Mugu Naval Air Station in California. Jump-off point for the trip aboard Air Force One, taking him from his California vacation back to work in Washington. A vacation cut short by the shooting down of Korean Airlines Flight 7 by the Soviets, with the apparent loss of as many as 269 all of the persons aboard. President Reagan is expected to deliver a statement shortly. 3 possible subjects, we're told: the plane incident, the dispatch of 2,000 more Marines to the troubled Middle East, and the latest major shock, word this morning of the death of veteran and respected Senator Henry Jackson of Washington State, dead of a heart attack. As we await the president's statement, and he'll be giving it after he gets off his helicopter, these other developments today on the flight shot down over Sakhalin Island by the Russians. From Moscow, still no official confirmation of the plane's downing. Just that there was, quote, an accident, but not even what kind of accident from the Soviets, and nothing in the way of an apology. Also, word today that among the possibly as many as 269 passengers were 51 Americans. And later today, here in New York, a UN Security Council session expected to get underway, called by the U.S. and South Korea to condemn the Soviet action in the court of public opinion. This picture is live from the Point Mugu Naval Air Station in California. The routine in California is the president is helicoptered from his ranch at Santa Barbara to this Mugu Naval Air Station, where he transfers from the helicopter to Air Force One. Crisp salutes by the president to those military officers in charge of making sure that his helicoptering and airplaning go off all as scheduled. The president had been reluctant to cut short his vacation as late as mid-afternoon yesterday, but according to CBS News correspondent Bill Plant, who's with the presidential party, that changed early last evening.
First, let me just say that Nancy and I were deeply saddened last night to learn of the death of Senator Henry Jackson. He was a friend, a colleague, a true patriot, and a devoted servant of the people. He will be sorely missed, and we both extend our deepest sympathy to his family. Now, in the wake of the barbaric act committed yesterday by the Soviet regime against a commercial jetliner, the United States and many other countries of the world made clear and compelling statements that expressed not only our outrage, but also our demand for a truthful accounting of the facts. Our first emotions are anger, disbelief, and profound sadness. While events in Afghanistan and elsewhere have left few illusions about the willingness of the Soviet Union to advance its interests through violence and intimidation, all of us had hoped that certain irreducible standards of civilized behavior nonetheless obtained. But this event shocks the sensibilities of people everywhere. The tradition in the civilized world has always been to offer help to mariners and pilots who are lost or in distress on the sea or in the air. Where human life is valued, extraordinary efforts are extended to preserve and protect it. And it's essential that as civilized societies, we ask searching questions about the nature of regimes where such standards do not apply. Beyond these emotions, the world notes the stark contrast that exists between Soviet words and deeds. What can we think of a regime that so broadly trumpets its vision of peace and global disarmament, and yet so callously and quickly commits a terrorist act to sacrifice the lives of innocent human beings? What can be said about Soviet credibility when they so flagrantly lie about such a heinous act? What can be the scope of legitimate mutual discourse with a state whose values permit such atrocities? And what are we to make of a regime which establishes one set of standards for itself and another for the rest of humankind? We've joined in the call for an urgent United Nations Security Council meeting today. The brutality of this act should not be compounded through silence or the cynical distortion of the evidence now at hand. And tonight, I will be meeting with my advisors to conduct a formal review of this matter. And this weekend, I shall be meeting with the congressional leadership. To the families of all those on the ill-fated aircraft, we send our deepest sympathy, and I hope they know our prayers are with them all.
President Reagan at the Point Mugu Naval Air Station in California, disembarking from his helicopter, issuing a statement, and now about to aboard Air Force One for a trip back to Washington. A forcefully delivered, forceful statement by the president, including, for the first time from the president's own mouth, we hear him describe what happened north of Japan as a terrorist act. The president also used the word lie. He's done that before in referring to the Soviets, of course, but used the word lie to describe some of what has been said and done. And perhaps most significantly, the president asking the question, and not rhetorically, what valued discourse with a people such as the Soviets when we are faced with what they did the last few days. That, of course, a paraphrase from President Reagan, but by any standard, a tough and forceful statement.
This is a CBS News special report, a presidential address. Here is Dan Rather.
Good evening. It's been 5 days now since a Soviet warplane shot down Korean Airlines Flight 7 after the civilian passenger liner went into Soviet airspace. 269 people, 61 of them Americans, including a United States congressman, were killed. During those 5 days, the Soviet attack has been condemned by much of the world. Some of the strongest language has come from President Reagan and his administration. Tonight, from the Oval Office, the President will add to that condemnation. Here is the President of the United States.
My fellow Americans, I'm coming before you tonight about the Korean airline massacre, the attack by the Soviet Union against 269 innocent men, women, and children aboard an unarmed Korean passenger plane. This crime against humanity must never be forgotten, here or throughout the world. Our prayers tonight are with the victims and their families in their time of terrible grief. Our hearts go out to them, to brave people like Catherine McDonald, the wife of a congressman whose composure and eloquence on the day of her husband's death moved us all. He will be sorely missed by all of us here in government. The parents of one slain couple wired me, our daughter and her husband died on Korean Airline Flight 007. Their deaths were the result of the Soviet Union violating every concept of human rights. The emotions of these parents, grief, shock, anger, are shared by civilized people everywhere. From around the world, press accounts reflect an explosion of condemnation by people everywhere. Let me state as plainly as I can, there was absolutely no justification, either legal or moral, for what the Soviets did. One newspaper in India said, if every passenger plane is fair game for home air forces, it will be the end to civil aviation as we know it. This is not the first time the Soviet Union has shot at and hit a civilian airliner when it overflew its territory. In another tragic incident in 1978, the Soviets also shot down an unarmed civilian airliner after having positively identified it as such. In that instance, the Soviet interceptor pilot clearly identified the civilian markings on the side of the aircraft, repeatedly questioned the order to fire on a civilian airliner, and was ordered to shoot it down anyway. The aircraft was hit with a missile and made a crash landing. Several innocent people lost their lives in this attack, killed by shrapnel from the blast of a Soviet missile. Is this a practice of other countries in the world? The answer is no. Commercial aircraft from the Soviet Union and Cuba on a number of occasions have overflown sensitive United States military facilities. They weren't shot down. We and other civilized countries believe in the tradition of offering help to mariners and pilots who are lost or in distress on the sea or in the air. Who are lost or in distress on the sea or in the air. We believe in following procedures to prevent a tragedy, not to provoke one. But despite the savagery of their crime, the universal reaction against it, and the evidence of their complicity, the Soviets still refuse to tell the truth. They have persistently refused to admit that their pilot fired on the Korean aircraft. Indeed, they've not even told their own people that a plane was shot down. They have spun a confused tale of tracking the plane by radar until it just mysteriously disappeared from their radar screens, that no one fired a shot of any kind. But then they coupled this with charges that it was a spy plane sent by us and that their planes fired tracer bullets past the plane as a warning that it was in Soviet airspace. Let me recap for a moment and present the incontrovertible evidence that we have. The Korean airliner, a Boeing 747, left Anchorage, Alaska, bound for Seoul, Korea, on a course south and west, which would take it across Japan. Out over the Pacific, in international waters, it was for a brief time in the vicinity of one of our reconnaissance planes, an RC-135 on a routine mission. At no time was the RC-135 in Soviet airspace. The Korean airliner flew on, and the two planes were soon widely separated. 747 is equipped with the most modern computerized navigation facilities. But a computer must respond to input provided by human hands. No one will ever know whether a mistake was made in giving the computer the course or whether there was a malfunction. Whichever, the 747 was flying a course further to the west than it was supposed to fly, a course which took it into Soviet airspace. The Soviets tracked this plane for 2.5 hours while it flew a straight line course at 30 to 35,000 feet. Only civilian airliners fly in such a manner. At one point, the Korean pilot gave Japanese air control his position as east of Hokkaido, Japan, showing that he was unaware they were off course by as much or more than 100 miles. The Soviets scrambled jet interceptors from a base in Sakhalin Island. Japanese ground sites recorded the interceptor plane's radio transmissions, their conversations with their own ground control. We only have the voices from the pilots. The Soviet ground-to-air transmissions were not recorded. It's plain, however, from the pilot's words, he's responding to orders and queries from his own ground control. Here's a brief segment of the tape, which we're going to play in its entirety for the United Nations Security Council tomorrow. Those were the voices of the Soviet pilots. In this tape, the pilot who fired the missile describes his search for what he calls the target. He reports he has it in sight. Indeed, he pulls up to within about a mile of the Korean plane, mentions its flashing strobe light and that its navigation lights are on. He then reports he's reducing speed to get behind the airliner, gives his distance from the plane at various points in this maneuver, and finally announces what can only be called the Korean airline massacre. He says he has locked on the radar, which aims his missiles, has launched those missiles, the target has been destroyed, and he is breaking off the attack. Let me point out something here having to do with his close-up view of the airliner on what we know was a clear night with a half moon. The 747 has a unique and distinctive silhouette, unlike any other plane in the world. There is no way a pilot could mistake this for anything other than a civilian airliner. And if that isn't enough, let me point out our RC-135 that I mentioned earlier had been back at its base in Alaska on the ground for an hour when the murderous attack took place over the Sea of Japan. And make no mistake about it, this attack was not just against ourselves or the Republic of Korea. This was the Soviet Union against the world and the moral precepts which guide human relations among people everywhere. It was an act of barbarism, born of a society which wantonly disregards individual rights and the value of human life and seeks constantly to expand and dominate other nations. They deny the deed, but in their conflicting and misleading protestations, the Soviets reveal that, yes, shooting down a plane, even one with hundreds of innocent men, women, children, and babies, is a part of their normal procedure if that plane is in what they claim as their airspace. They owe the world an apology and an offer to join the rest of the world in working out a system to protect against this ever happening again. Among the rest of us, there is one protective measure, an international radio wavelength on which pilots can communicate with planes of other nations if they are in trouble or lost. Soviet military planes are not so equipped because that would make it easier for pilots who might want to defect. Our request to send vessels into Soviet waters to search for wreckage and bodies has received no satisfactory answer. Bereaved families of the Japanese victims were harassed by Soviet patrol boats when they tried to get near where the plane is believed to have gone down in order to hold a ceremony for their dead. But we shouldn't be surprised by such inhuman brutality. Memories come back of Czechoslovakia, Hungary, Poland, the gassing villages in Afghanistan. If the massacre and their subsequent conduct is intended to intimidate, they have failed in their purpose. From every corner of the globe, the word is defiance in the face of this unspeakable act.
and defiance of the system which excuses it and tries to cover it up. With our horror and our sorrow, there is a righteous and terrible anger. It would be easy to think in terms of vengeance, but that is not a proper answer. We want justice and action to see that this never happens again. Our immediate challenge to this atrocity is to ensure that we make the skies safer and that we seek just compensation for the families of those who were killed. Since my return to Washington, we've held long meetings, the most recent yesterday with the congressional leadership. There was a feeling of unity in the room, and I received a number of constructive suggestions. We will continue to work with the Congress regarding our response to this massacre. As you know, we immediately made known to the world these shocking facts as honestly and completely as they came to us. We have notified the Soviets that we will not renew our bilateral agreement for cooperation in the field of transportation so long as they threaten the security of civil aviation. Since 1981, the Soviet airline Aeroflot has been denied the right to fly to the United States. We have reaffirmed that order and are examining additional steps we can take with regard to Aeroflot facilities in this country. We're cooperating with other countries to find better means to ensure the safety of civil aviation and to join us in not accepting Aeroflot as a normal member of the international civil air community unless and until the Soviets satisfy the cries of humanity for justice. I'm pleased to report that Canada today suspended Aeroflot's landing and refueling privileges for 60 days. We have joined with other countries to press the International Civil Aviation Organization to investigate this crime at an urgent special session of the Council. At the same time, we're listening most carefully to private groups, both American and international, airline pilots, passenger associations, and others who have a special interest in civil air safety. I am asking the Congress to pass a joint resolution of condemnation of this Soviet crime. We have informed the Soviets that we're suspending negotiations on several bilateral arrangements we had under consideration. Along with Korea and Japan, we called an emergency meeting of the UN Security Council, which began on Friday. On that first day, Korea, Japan, Canada, Australia, the Netherlands, Pakistan, France, China, the United Kingdom, Zaire, New Zealand, and West Germany all joined us in denouncing the Soviet action and expressing our horror. We expect to hear from additional countries as debate resumes tomorrow. We intend to work with the 13 countries who had citizens aboard the Korean airliner to seek reparations for the families of all those who were killed. The United States will bring a claim against the Soviet Union within the next week to obtain compensation for the benefit of the victims' survivors. Such compensation is an absolute moral duty which Soviets must assume. In the economic area in general, we're redoubling our efforts with our allies to end the flow of military and strategic items to the Soviet Union. Secretary Shultz will go to Madrid to meet with representatives of 35 countries who, for 3 years, have been negotiating an agreement having to do with, among other things, human rights. Foreign Minister Gromyko of the Soviet Union is scheduled to attend that meeting. If he does come to the meeting,